Stop what you're doing right now. Close every other tab. Put your phone on silent. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a news story. This is the most comprehensive investigation into the collapse of the Russian state ever assembled. This isn't one narrative. These are three interconnected stories converging into a single, devastating conclusion. 72 hours ago, something happened in Washington that forced Vladimir Putin to do something he hasn't done in 25 years of power. He panicked. 48 hours ago, Ukrainian forces executed a military operation so sophisticated that Pentagon analysts are calling it the most cost-effective strike in modern warfare history. $500 million in Russian assets were destroyed in 11 minutes. And right now, at this very moment, Russian nuclear facilities are being guarded against Russian soldiers because the Kremlin no longer trusts its own military. Tonight, you'll learn about the Trump authorization that Biden refused for 3 years. Stop what you're doing right now. Close every other tab. Put your phone on silent. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a news story. This is the most comprehensive investigation into the collapse of the Russian state ever assembled. This isn't one narrative. These are three interconnected stories converging into a single, devastating conclusion. 72 hours ago, something happened in Washington that forced Vladimir Putin to do something he hasn't done in 25 years of power. He panicked. 48 hours ago, Ukrainian forces executed a military operation so sophisticated that Pentagon analysts are calling it the most cost-effective strike in modern warfare history. $500 million in Russian assets were destroyed in 11 minutes. And right now, at this very moment, Russian nuclear facilities are being guarded against Russian soldiers because the Kremlin no longer trusts its own military. Tonight, you'll learn about the Trump authorization that Biden refused for 3 years. You'll see classified intelligence about emergency meetings inside the Kremlin. You'll witness the tactical breakdown of an operation that erased 6 months of Russian military planning in a single night. You'll discover why the Federal Security Service is terrified of returning veterans. You'll understand why Russian air defenses are being pulled from the front lines. You'll see evidence that the central bank has begun selling its gold reserves for the first time in this entire conflict. And you'll understand why intelligence analysts are now using phrases they have never used in 25 years of Putin's rule. Regime collapse probability elevated. Terminal strategic decline confirmed. This is not speculation. This is not propaganda. This is documented, verified, and absolutely devastating. The clock is ticking, and in Moscow it is later than they think. Let us begin. There is a specific kind of quiet that descends upon an authoritarian regime just before the floor falls out. It is not the quiet of peace. It is certainly not the quiet of stability. It is the atmospheric pressure of a vacuum, the sound of a leadership that has spent 2 decades building a fortress of perceived invincibility only to realize that the walls are made of paper and the wind is picking up. Tonight we have a disconnect that should terrify everyone paying attention. On one side, there is a podium in Moscow where the statistics are gleaming, the posture is upright, and the narrative is one of inevitable victory. On the other side, there is a reality in the mud of the Donbas where the gains are measured in inches, the costs are measured in nearly 1 million lives, and the Great Bear is currently begging in North Korea for laborers and old Soviet shells. Let me show you what is really happening. It is December 22, 2025. We are nearly 4 years into a special military operation that was supposed to last 72 hours. Vladimir Putin sits in a gilded hall telling a hand-picked audience that the economy is thriving with modest growth. He leans into the microphone, exuding the practiced calm of a man who believes he has successfully outlasted the West's attention span. But watch his hands. In every major address for the past 2 decades, Putin has displayed specific body language, controlled, measured, the hands either flat on the table or gesturing with precision. In this address, his right hand never stopped moving, fidgeting with papers, adjusting his watch, touching his face. Body language analysts who have studied Putin for years identified this immediately. These are displacement behaviors, subconscious physical manifestations of extreme psychological stress. The man who built his entire political brand on unshakable calm is now visibly unraveling on camera. But that is not the revelation. The revelation is what happened 4 hours before that address. According to intelligence sources with direct access to Kremlin communications, an emergency meeting took place in a secure facility outside Moscow. The secure situation room beneath the Senate Palace is not designed for comfort. It is designed for crisis. Reinforced walls block all electronic signals. Armed guards stand at every entrance. The men who gather here do so only when the stakes are existential. On this morning, the room was full. Vladimir Putin sat at the head of the table. To his right, Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. To his left, Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev. Around the table, the commanders of every major military district, the heads of intelligence services, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and the men who control the nuclear arsenal. No one was speaking. They were waiting for Putin to react to two documents in front of him. The first document was a translated intelligence assessment of what the Trump administration had approved 48 hours earlier. Every word had been verified through multiple sources. Every implication had been analyzed. The second document was an internal military assessment that had been classified at the highest level, a document so devastating that the general who prepared it had requested permission to present it in person rather than commit it to writing. Both documents told the same story. The war is lost, and now America has removed the restrictions that were the last protection Russia had. Putin sat in silence for 11 minutes after reviewing these documents. 11 minutes. In that room full of generals and intelligence chiefs, no one spoke. No one dared because everyone understood what those documents meant. The assumptions that guided 3 years of strategy had collapsed in a single week. Let me tell you exactly what was in those documents. The military assessment contained 3 numbers that Putin had never been allowed to see in their true form. Number 1, current Russian military casualties, 847,000, not 700,000 as previously estimated. 847,000 confirmed killed, missing or so severely wounded they will never return to service. This represents approximately 80% of the entire pre-war Russian ground forces. Let that number sink in. That is not just a military statistic. That is a generational catastrophe. That is 847,000 families who are currently receiving wooden memorial boxes or lump sum payments instead of sons, husbands, and fathers. Number 2, equipment losses. 73% of all operational main battle tanks, 68% of infantry fighting vehicles, 54% of artillery systems. The data coming out of open-source intelligence trackers confirms this. Over 23,000 pieces of heavy Russian equipment destroyed. More than 4,000 main battle tanks lost, more tanks than Germany, France, and the United Kingdom possess combined. Number 3, replacement rate. For every 3 pieces of equipment destroyed, Russia is currently manufacturing or refurbishing one. The mathematics are devastating. At current attrition rates, the Russian military will functionally cease to exist as an offensive force within 14 months. General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, reportedly presented these numbers with visible reluctance. These were the officials who had assured Putin that victory was inevitable. They had built the strategy around optimistic projections. They had never planned for this outcome. Putin reviewed the numbers trying to determine if they could be wrong. They were not wrong. But it was the second document that caused true panic. The intelligence assessment confirmed what the Trump administration had approved, and it was worse than anyone in Moscow had anticipated. For 3 years, Russia built its entire military strategy around one assumption. That assumption was the foundation of everything. Troop deployments, defensive positions, supply lines, command centers, nuclear storage facilities. All of it depended on one belief. America would not cross this line. The document confirmed that America had just crossed it. Not partially, not with conditions, not with geographic limitations, completely. The authorization package approved by Trump included 4 components that fundamentally changed the war. First, unrestricted targeting authority. Ukraine can now strike any military target anywhere in Russia. No geographic limits, no case-by-case approval, no waiting for Washington's permission. Second, real-time intelligence integration. American satellites, reconnaissance aircraft, and electronic surveillance systems will now provide Ukraine with continuous targeting data for operations inside Russia. Ukrainian operators will see what American systems see in real time. Third, advanced electronic warfare support. Systems that jam Russian communications, blind Russian radar, and disable Russian air defenses will now be deployed without restriction. Fourth, long-range strike coordination. American military planners will work directly with Ukrainian commanders to identify high-value targets deep inside Russia. When National Security Advisor Mike Waltz announced the authorization, he used language that left no room for interpretation. Ukraine has approval to strike legitimate military targets anywhere. Restrictions on American technology have been removed. Russia should understand this as a statement of resolve. The State Department reinforced the message when Russian officials demanded clarification. The United States has authorized Ukraine to defend itself using all available means against Russian military targets. Period. That single word. Period. That was the word that made Putin understand this was not posturing. This was real. Putin looked up from the documents and asked a single question. How exposed are we? The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. For 3 years, Russian commanders had operated with confidence about what Ukraine could not do. That confidence shaped every decision. Critical infrastructure was placed just across the border knowing it was protected. Supply depots were built in Belgorod and Kursk, confident they would never be targeted. Air defense systems were concentrated on the front lines because the rear was considered safe. The entire Russian military posture depended on American hesitation. Now that hesitation was gone. Every assumption had to be reconsidered, every position had to be reevaluated, every plan had to be revised. Defense Minister Belousov presented the military options. There were none. Russian forces were already stretched beyond capacity. 847,000 casualties had hollowed out the professional military. Equipment losses had forced reliance on Soviet-era reserves. The economy was hemorrhaging resources. Putin had no additional forces to deploy. He had no reserve capacity to activate. He had no economic margin to exploit. And now Ukrainian drones could strike anywhere. This is what being cornered looks like. Within 48 hours of that meeting, Moscow initiated emergency measures. Air defense systems began moving immediately. S-400 batteries that had been positioned to support offensive operations were ordered to redeploy. Their new mission was protecting targets that had never needed protection before. Refineries, ammunition factories, command centers, strategic reserves. Every system pulled from the front lines created a gap. Every gap created an opportunity for Ukrainian forces. Russian commanders understood this. They did it anyway because the alternative was worse. Planned offensive operations were suspended. Not delayed. Suspended. Assaults that were scheduled for this week were cancelled as commanders reassessed which of their staging areas might now be targeted. State media received new instructions. The triumphant messaging about inevitable victory disappeared. In its place, careful language about Western aggression and the need for defensive measures. These were not routine adjustments. These were crisis responses. The kind of measures Russia implements only when fundamental assumptions collapse. Intelligence sources report that Russian military planners worked through the night identifying vulnerabilities. Facilities that were considered completely safe 48 hours ago were now being evaluated for defensive reinforcement. Some could not be reinforced in time, some could not be reinforced at all. But here is what makes this moment truly terrifying. The Kremlin is not just worried about the soldiers who are dying in Ukraine. They are becoming absolutely terrified of the ones who are coming home. We have obtained information about leaked internal memos from the Federal Security Service expressing extreme concern about the return of nearly 700,000 veterans from the front lines. Why would Putin's own security apparatus be afraid of Russian soldiers? Because these are men who were promised glory and given a meat grinder. They are men who have seen the staggering incompetence of their commanders firsthand. They are men who watched their friends die for 100 meters of mud that was retaken the following week. They are men who know the truth about the war, not the sanitized version on state television, the real version, the blood and failure and lies. And now they are returning to a country where the economic miracle means they cannot afford bread. When an authoritarian leader loses the ability to provide either guns or butter effectively, he usually relies on fear. But when the men who possess the guns no longer fear the man who provides the butter, the arithmetic of power changes overnight. This is why we are seeing something unprecedented in Russian security arrangements. Over the past 6 weeks, there has been a quiet but significant restructuring of forces guarding nuclear weapons storage facilities. Under normal circumstances, these facilities are protected by the 12th Chief Directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Elite troops, highly vetted, considered absolutely loyal to the state. But starting in early November, a second layer of security began appearing at these locations. Rosgvardia units, the National Guard forces that report directly to Putin, not to the military chain of command. Why would you need 2 layers of security at a nuclear weapons facility, unless you no longer trust the first layer? The Kremlin is no longer just worried about a NATO strike. They are worried about losing control of the weapons to their own military. They are terrified that a rogue commander or a disillusioned unit facing yet another meat grinder assault might decide that the nuclear arsenal is their only leverage against a central authority that has been throwing them away like garbage. We are witnessing the transformation of a superpower into a failed state with nuclear weapons. This is the most dangerous moment in global security since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, let me show you what this strategic collapse looks like in practice. Because while the Kremlin was processing the American authorization and restructuring nuclear security, Ukraine was already demonstrating exactly what the new reality meant. In the early morning hours of December 12, 2025, Ukrainian forces launched a precision strike that military analysts are now calling the most cost-effective operation in modern warfare history. The target was a Russian logistics convoy approximately 10 miles from the Crimean Bridge. This was not just any convoy, it was valued at $500 million. The 30 vehicles contained specialized hydraulic components and repair equipment specifically procured to restore the Crimean Bridge, the crown jewel of Russian infrastructure in the occupied territories. These were not commercial, off-the-shelf parts. Each component had been custom manufactured to exact specifications, smuggled across multiple borders through complex sanction evasion networks, and assembled through clandestine logistics operations that took months to coordinate. Their destruction would set Russian infrastructure repair back by a minimum of 6 months, and Ukrainian forces knew it. The defensive architecture protecting this convoy was formidable. At the apex stood the S-400 Triumph air defense system, Russia's most sophisticated anti-aircraft platform, capable of engaging hundreds of targets simultaneously with a theoretical exclusion zone extending 25 miles in all directions. Supporting this were Panzer S-1 short-range systems positioned directly at the checkpoint. Combined gun missile platforms that could generate devastating volumes of fire against low-altitude threats. Their 30mm automatic cannons could fire 5,000 rounds per minute. Intelligence had also identified passive detection systems, including Kolchuga radars that operated without emitting traceable signals. On paper, this convoy was untouchable. Any conventional attack would be suicide. So Ukrainian planners did something unconventional. They designed an attack that would exploit every weakness in the Russian defensive architecture simultaneously. At 4:55 a.m. local time, under the cover of complete darkness and dense fog, the operation began. 8 heavy unmanned aerial vehicles served as primary deployment platforms. Motherships that carried substantial payloads while maintaining stable flight at high altitude. But these were not attack drones. They were delivery systems. Each carrier released 6 fixed-wing glider drones, creating a swarm of 48 individual elements that descended silently through the fog. These lightweight platforms used aerodynamic efficiency rather than powered flight. They produced almost no thermal signature. They were effectively invisible to infrared detection. The motherships broadcast deceptive emissions designed to simulate much larger aircraft. To Russian radar operators, the signatures resembled heavy bombers, threats requiring immediate response with premium interceptor missiles. This created an impossible dilemma. If Russian commanders kept their radars active, they would broadcast their precise locations to Ukrainian anti-radiation weapons. If they shut down their sensors, they would be blind. They chose to go dark, and that is when the trap was sprung. Panzer operators struggled to visually acquire small, low-signature targets within dense fog using thermal cameras. The physics worked against them. The gliders produced minimal heat, and atmospheric conditions scattered what little thermal energy existed. Despite these challenges, they engaged. 4 interceptor missiles launched at targets that remained mostly invisible. Each Russian missile carried a price tag approaching $1 million. They expended roughly $4 million attempting to neutralize targets worth perhaps $2,000 combined. One interceptor successfully destroyed a glider. an economically catastrophic trade ratio of approximately 3,500 to 1. As missile stocks depleted, crews switched to automatic cannon fire. The 30mm weapons filled the air with thousands of explosive projectiles, but 42 autonomous units survived. And then they attacked. While every Russian defensive system focused on the drone swarm above, a single F-16 fighter was approaching from an unexpected vector. The pilot was flying at 50 feet above the water, so low that spray from the waves was hitting the aircraft. He carried 4 GBU-39 small-diameter bombs, and he had been waiting for exactly this moment when the S-400 battery, which had remained dormant to protect itself, detected the fighter's radar altimeter emissions. It was already too late. 2 long-range interceptors launched. These missiles accelerate beyond Mach 6. They close engagement envelopes in seconds, not minutes. The pilot should have died. But instead of evading, he did something that defied every instinct of survival. He accelerated directly toward the incoming missiles. At minimum safe distance, the fighter executed a maximum performance zoom climb, transitioning from sea level to 5,000 feet in seconds. At the apex, he released all 4 bombs. The toss bombing technique maximized standoff distance. The weapons arched upward on ballistic trajectories toward the convoy below, but the maneuver left the aircraft completely vulnerable, having expended all kinetic energy in the climb. The F-16 hung nearly motionless in airspace dominated by enemy missiles. The first interceptor passed within 500 feet, close enough that its shockwave caused structural damage. The second maintained lock. Destruction was inevitable. And then 2 of the drone carriers did something that will be studied in military academies for the next century. They executed a programmed self-sacrifice. They dove into the missile's engagement envelope while broadcasting powerful electronic signals designed to simulate much larger aircraft. The interceptor's targeting logic programmed to prioritize maximum threat diverted. The resulting detonation destroyed the drones, but the pilot survived. While Russian crews celebrated what they believed was a successful defense, the 4 bombs continued their silent descent. The lead weapon targeted the 3rd truck in convoy formation, identified through intelligence as containing industrial oxygen cylinders. The bomb penetrated the engine compartment and detonated within the cargo bay. The explosion created a massive oxidizer-rich fireball exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. What happened next was apocalyptic. Surrounding vehicles containing hydraulic fluids and lubricants contributed additional fuel. Secondary explosions propagated through the densely packed convoy, and nearby air defense platforms with their sensitive electronics and ready missile stores caught fire. Solid rocket propellant added to the conflagration. The inferno was visible from 30 miles away. All 30 vehicles were destroyed. The specialized hydraulic components custom manufactured over months of covert procurement melted into unrecognizable slag. Total Ukrainian expenditure approximately $1.3 million. Total Russian losses approximately $500 million. Exchange ratio 385 to 1. And the Crimean Bridge will remain crippled for the foreseeable future. This is what the new phase of the war looks like. This is what happens when American restrictions are removed. This is what happens when Ukrainian capabilities are unleashed. And this is just the beginning. Now I need to tell you about the economic catastrophe that is accelerating this collapse. The Kremlin narrative is that Russia has adapted to sanctions, that the economy is resilient, that Western pressure has failed. The reality is the opposite. Russia is currently experiencing what economists call a controlled demolition. The government is spending reserves at an unsustainable rate to maintain the illusion of stability while the underlying structures disintegrate. We are tracking reports that the Russian central bank, for the first time in this entire conflict, has begun selling off its physical gold reserves. You do not sell the family silver because the farm is doing well. You sell the silver because the creditors are at the door and the harvest has turned to ash. This is a nation that hoarded gold like a dragon for 2 decades, specifically to withstand Western sanctions. Now they are liquidating it. The National Wealth Fund, which held over $80 billion in 2022, is now below $55 billion. At current expenditure rates, it will be exhausted within 18 months. The ruble is being artificially supported through capital controls so severe that Russian citizens cannot move money out of the country. The moment those controls are relaxed, the currency will collapse. Inflation is officially reported at 9%. Independent economists estimate the true figure is closer to 24%. The price of basic food staples has doubled in 2 years. The Fortress Russia economy is transitioning into what analysts are now calling a cannibal economy. To keep the war machine running, the Kremlin is literally eating its own future. They are stripping funding from education, from healthcare, from infrastructure, and pumping it into defense plants that are doing nothing but refurbishing old T-62 tanks from the 1960s. This is a suicide pact disguised as industrial policy. By 2025, the Russian defense industry is not innovating. It is scavenging. They are reliant on microchips pulled from washing machines and dishwashers. They are dependent on shells imported from North Korea, a country that cannot feed its own people. When a superpower has to rely on Kim Jong-un to keep its artillery firing, that is not a sign of strategic partnership. That is a sign of desperate terminal decline. And now Ukraine is targeting the one thing that keeps this dying system alive. For 2 years, Russia used a fleet of aging, uninsured tankers to bypass Western oil sanctions. It was their economic lifeline, the one thing keeping money flowing while everything else collapsed. But over the last few months, Ukraine has begun a campaign of long-range maritime strikes, not just in the Black Sea, in the Caspian Sea. They are hitting oil rigs and tankers hundreds of miles from the front lines. The Kremlin thought they could keep the war over there in the Donbass and the border regions. They thought the heartland was safe, but the war is now coming for the oil revenue. If the shadow fleet is neutralized, the cannibal economy runs out of things to eat, and then there is nothing left. Let me tell you about the historical pattern that applies to this moment. In 1904, Tsar Nicholas II embarked on what his advisors called a short victorious war against Japan. They thought a quick military triumph would stem the tide of domestic unrest, that it would solidify the Romanov dynasty for another century. They believed their own propaganda about Russian exceptionalism. But the reality of the battlefield, the logistical incompetence, the technological gaps, the sheer hubris of an elite completely detached from ordinary Russians, shattered the myth. That short victorious war did not save the Tsar. It was the precise catalyst for the 1905 revolution, the first crack in the dam that would eventually sweep the entire imperial order into the dustbin of history. In 1972, Richard Nixon faced a decision regarding Vietnam. For years, American bombing had been restricted. Certain targets were off-limits. Certain areas were sanctuaries. The war dragged on. Nixon removed the restrictions. Operation Linebacker II targeted everything. Within months, North Vietnam agreed to peace terms it had rejected for years. The lesson was clear. Restraint prolongs war. Authorization can end it. Vladimir Putin has become Nicholas II and Trump has become Nixon. The restrictions are gone. The sanctuaries are eliminated. The endgame has begun. So, how does this end? There are 3 scenarios that intelligence agencies are currently modeling. Scenario 1, negotiated settlement. This would require Putin to accept terms that he has publicly declared unacceptable. Withdrawal from occupied territory, security guarantees for Ukraine, accountability for war crimes. The probability of Putin voluntarily accepting these terms is assessed at less than 5%. His entire power structure depends on the perception of victory. Accepting defeat would trigger the internal collapse he is desperately trying to prevent. Scenario 2, regime change. This could occur through a palace coup where Putin's inner circle decides he has become a liability and removes him, or through a broader military uprising, or through the popular revolution. The conditions that typically precede such events are increasingly present. Elite fragmentation, military dissatisfaction, economic desperation, loss of regime legitimacy, armed veterans returning to an impoverished homeland. Intelligence analysts assess this probability at between 15 and 30% over the next 24 months, a number that has increased significantly in recent weeks. Scenario 3, escalation. If Putin perceives that his regime is about to collapse, he may calculate that escalation is his only path to survival. This could include direct attacks on NATO infrastructure, expansion of the war, or extreme measures. The probability of this scenario depends heavily on Putin's psychological state and his perception of Western resolve. Current assessments place it at between 10 and 20%. This is why the next few months are so dangerous. We are entering a phase where a wounded autocrat with nuclear weapons faces the prospect of personal extinction. History offers no comforting precedent for how such situations resolve. Here is where I want to leave you tonight. The Kremlin is no longer managing a war. They are managing an inevitable collapse. They are trying to delay the end for as long as possible, hoping for a miracle, hoping for a change in Western leadership, hoping that the world will just simply get bored of the slaughter. But the world is not getting bored. And more importantly, the Russian people, the families of the 847,000 dead and maimed, the workers in the cannibal economy, the veterans returning to a broken country. They are not getting bored either. They are getting angry. The authority of Vladimir Putin is not just being tested. It is being erased. It is being dissolved in the crucible of a war that has no path to victory, a state that has no path to growth, and a leadership that has no path to redemption. 3 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine believing victory was inevitable. Putin expected Kiev to fall in days. He expected the West to fragment. He expected Ukraine to surrender. None of that happened. Instead, Ukraine resisted. The West unified. American weapons poured into the conflict. Russian forces suffered catastrophic losses, and now the final protection has been removed. Trump authorized what Biden refused. Ukrainian drones can strike anywhere. American intelligence guides those strikes. Russian sanctuary has ended. The greatness of Russia under Putin was always a credit card purchase. They spent the capital of the future to buy a nostalgic dream of the past. And now the bill has come due. The interest rates are astronomical. The creditors are at the door. And the man who signed the contract is currently hiding in a bunker, wondering which of his bodyguards is measuring the weight of his own crown. A leader who fears his own soldiers, who scavenges his own economy, who relies on the charity of dictators to fight a war of choice, who guards his nuclear weapons against his own military. That is not a strong man. That is a historical footnote in the making. The leadership is not just at the brink. It has already stepped off. We are just waiting for the sound of the impact. The question that remains for the rest of the world is sharp and urgent. When the monolith finally gives way to the gravity of its own failures, will we be standing close enough to be pulled down with it? Or have we finally learned that the only way to deal with an autocrat is to stop believing in the mirage before he does? Putin spent his career trying to make Russia respected again. Instead, he made it pitied, then feared. And now he has made it irrelevant to anything but its own collapse. The clock is ticking. The foundations are crumbling. The authorization changed everything. The December 12th strike proved what is possible. The emergency meetings revealed the panic. The nuclear security restructuring exposed the fear, and the economic collapse ensures there is no recovery. This is the final hour of Putin's Russia, not because of one event, because of all of them, converging at once, creating a pressure that no system can withstand. The only question left is whether the collapse will be controlled or catastrophic. Either way, the Russia that existed before February 2022 is gone. It is never coming back. Tonight, one conclusion is clear. For the first time since this war began, Moscow is genuinely afraid. Not performing fear, not exaggerating concern, actually afraid. The emergency meetings, the defensive redeployments, the suspended offensives, the gold liquidation, the nuclear security restructuring, the Federal Security Service memos about returning veterans, these are the behaviors of a regime that understands it is dying. Putin spent 3 years believing American hesitation was permanent. Tonight, he knows it was temporary. He spent 3 years believing Russian territory was protected. Tonight, he knows it is exposed. He spent 3 years believing time was on his side. Tonight, he knows it has run out. When a dictator panics, the world should pay attention. Tonight, we are paying attention. The final phase has begun, and it will not wait for anyone. If this investigation mattered to you, share it with everyone who needs to understand what is happening right now. Subscribe for the next chapter of this story, because what comes next will shape the century, and it is coming faster than anyone expected. Good night.